Hello there, and welcome to this episode of JCT's Fascinating Hobbies 486 Revival. Today we're going to be working on the Digital Venturis, which I have actually bumped up the clock speed again to 40 MHz because it does actually run a lot faster than when it's on 33 MHz. Now what we're actually doing is we're going to be using a CF IDE adapter and a Gotek USB floppy emulator to get the machine to acknowledge the presence of this 16GB CF card that I have, compact flash card. Now the first thing to do is I've got hold of a piece of software called Ontrack, which is a dynamic drive overlay piece of software. So the first thing I did was I actually made sure that all of my BIOS allocations for the hard drives are set to none, so I don't want the BIOS having anything to do with the hard drive whatsoever. The second thing to do is to set my drive emulator to the relevant image that I've placed the Ontrack software onto, the relevant section of the USB stick. With the software that I'm using, you've got effectively emulated 100 floppy disks, and you use the software to write the image to that particular part of the floppy disk. Phil's Computer Labs actually covers this in quite a bit of detail, and I'll put a link in the description to that video. It is very useful. Now, once you've got the Ontrack software up, I have just basically stuck with using the easy way, the easy process to do this. Now initially I'm going to be starting with a DOS and Windows 3.1 setup, so what I'm going to do is set the system to allow me to use a FAT16 partition, and what's happening now is it's now splitting the card apparently into several separate FAT16 images. Now it does actually ask you to put your boot disk in the drive, so it can sort of copy some of the files over to the particular partition, your main partition. So you just simply select on the Gotek the number of the disk that's being emulated, and off it goes and it copies over the relevant files. Now it is read-wise and write-wise, the speed is similar if not slightly faster than a floppy disk, but the actual CF card itself is a lot faster than a comparable hard disk of the time. So then ask you to put the relevant image back on again, so I'm just putting the on-track image back, and it can now sort of carry on and doing all of its relevant copying. So the DOS partition has been created, the partitions have been formatted, and it does actually sort of specify or recommend that we actually update the config.sys file after we've installed DOS. And that'll be something that we'll be coming on to in a moment. Now, I had some problems actually getting the CF card to boot without any kind of floppy in the machine, so I've come to a bit of a halfway house. I have created a Ontrack boot disk, and I use that boot disk, which is basically just an emulated partition on my USB key, to start the machine, and it actually hosts the updated autoexec.bat and config.sys files, which all point to files on the cd-rom drive eventually. To be honest with you, so far this has been the only way that I've actually been able to get the machine to work. But it does work, and I'm happy to use it in this particular state. So it starts off with reading the card, and then boots onto the A:* partition. And what I can actually do now is just run the MS-DOS setup, which I've been doing. So just very quickly going through the MS-DOS setup. This actually actual section is obviously sped up quite a bit just to save time. But there are in total, if I recall, 4 disks, the fourth being a supplemental disk which contains additional programs that you don't have on the main 3 disks. But all of this is installed into the cd-rom partition, which the MS-DOS setup has been able to pick up and is happy to use. The Gotek device, my specific Ontrack USB image, is still being used to load in the overlay software. I believe that some overlay software does actually write additional features into the BIOS, but for whatever reason, possibly because this is a proprietary motherboard, it's not allowing me to do any of that, so I've had to go through this halfway house to be able to get the machine to work. It's a bit limiting, but it works, and I can do everything, hopefully, that I should be able to do. I mean, it's taken all of the devices and loading devices from the cd-rom partition, but obviously once DOS is installed, I'm now just going through and updating the config.sys file as it recommended me to do earlier. So to do that, you just select your Ontrack floppy partition or emulated partition on your stick, and let it boot into the Ontrack disk manager, which it's now doing. Now, the version that Phil's Computer Labs actually has is actually a later version than the one I'm using, and I'm actually going to try to get that later version working because I am wondering if that will solve some of the problems that I've been experiencing. There's also floating around on the internet a version 10 version somewhere, which is even later. So I am just wondering if using the later version will correct a number of the problems that I've had. That'll be something to try for a later project. So I've now updated the config.sys file, and the next thing to do is just to come out of Disk Manager and reboot the machine. Obviously I'm sort of making sure that I'm selecting the relevant drive, emulated drive on the USB stick before rebooting. And what that should do is it should actually take us quite nicely into a DOS prompt, and from there we can actually select some of the other images I've got on this and get Windows 3.11 for work groups on the machine, which should be nice and exciting. So it reads the floppy. First off, it reads the Ontrack software. So it's actually setting the system up for that CF card. Indeed, if you were actually using a larger hard drive, larger than 2 gigs, it would be setting the system up for that larger hard drive as well. So obviously this is not just for CF cards, it's also for hard drives which are above the 2 gigabyte capacity that MS-DOS can read. So we then start MS-DOS. And it's taken us into the setup again. So what actually happened here was I was using a boot image that actually had the MS-DOS setup software actually on the image. So what I actually did was I recreated my boot disk from within the Ontrack facility, and I changed it so that it was using just a plain boot disk. It wasn't actually using the MS-DOS setup disk, so it no longer actually goes into setup MS-DOS. So it just goes straight to a command prompt. What I also did was I copied the autoexec.bat and config.sys files over to the A:// partition, and I will need to do a little bit of tinkering with those files just to get some devices to load high. I just need to remember the syntax of actually being able to do that. So it's been a while since I've actually sort of played around with DOS to any degree, so it's all coming back, but just sort of takes a little bit of time. So when you actually sort of set a device to load high, instead of loading it into the base 640k of RAM, it actually chucks it into extended RAM. So it means that if you're trying to run games which tend to try to start, or certain games tend to try to start in the base 640k area of memory, you can actually get the system to free up some of that memory by loading devices into extended memory. So load high is a really sort of good switch to actually use for devices. if you are experiencing problems with a lack of RAM in a 640k area. It's a bit of a hangover from the original XT days where you had 640k of RAM and that was your lot. And what actually sort of happened was, as machines had more RAM available, that RAM was referred to as extended RAM, and you still had that 640k RAM hanging around. Now we have actually overcome that, so modern operating systems, we don't have that 640k barrier, but for quite a number of years it was a bit of an Achilles heel for the sort of Intel Microsoft platform, and obviously the Intel clones, AMD, Citrix, etc. Now, as you can see, I'm now installing Windows 3.11 for workgroups, which it looks very dated by today's standards, but it still looks quite pleasant. It's not particularly the most stable of front ends. At the time I was using RISC OS as my main operating system, and I was running Windows within a 486 PC emulator. So at the time I had a RISC PC, which is another project I've actually got to work on, which is actually trying to bring it back to life. But when you actually sort of look at RISC OS and you look at Windows, the comparisons are night and day. Sure, Windows had the compatibility but the overall sort of use of RISC OS was just vastly superior. The overall experience, far more stable. So Windows is actually now installed on this machine, and it's going to be interesting actually sort of trying to work out what I'm actually going to do next. Probably the first order of business, there is a heatsink on the processor at the moment, but I would like to just put a small fan on there just to help keep things a bit cooler. Second order of business is probably to get a sound card into the machine using one of the spare ISA slots. Third order of business, get some games on there, see what it can do. And after that, I don't know, possibly fit a cd-rom drive, get a faster processor, and sort of take it from there. Well, I've got to say, it's been a far more sort of positive video than it was the last video, so we've actually managed to get somewhere. We've actually got a machine that we can use. I'd like to thank you all again very much for watching, and if you would like this video, please don't forget to hit that like button, and also to subscribe for more unbelievably fascinating hobbies.